right next to me, we have Christina Noren, who is the CPO of CloudBees. All product management, all engineering, design, all docs, and product marketing, that all rolls up to you. And you've been doing product for 25 years?
Well, I've been doing different things in software for 25 years, but product for more than half of it, yeah.
And you've been at Splunk, and
Yeah, I was the founding VP of product at Splunk in 2005 and stayed through past the IPO in 2012.
cool.
Yeah.
And Matt Bielman?
I'm Matt Billman, CEO and co-founder of Netlify, and we are a platform that that developers use to build and maintain modern web projects with.
And I think most of y'all probably know Isaac Schluter at NPM, the founder and CPO.
Hello.
And you've been working in open source for... You
Working
look
at
remarkably young for how long you've been working in open source, because open source ages you.
it does. I've been pretty active in open source ever since I was at Yahoo and working on YUI back in 2009 or so. But in JavaScript ecosystem, over 10 years now.
And I'm Erin. As it says on the sign, I'm a developer relations program manager at Google. I work on the open source strategy team. I also run wordnik.com, which is the biggest dictionary nobody's ever heard of, which is now a 501c3 nonprofit. And when it was a venture-backed startup, we actually worked in open source. We released the API framework formerly known as Swagger, which is now OpenAPI. So there's a lot to talk about with open source. And I think one of the first things that people talk about in this context in open source is why, right? What are your free tier, your open source software, your community endeavors, and how do they contribute to your go-to-market strategy? Is it worth it? What's the ROI? And how do they inform your commercial products? I think, why don't we start with Christina?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know CloudBees, you probably know Jenkins. So we've been the major corporate sponsor and employer of the Jenkins founders and most Jenkins core committers since 2010. And the Jenkins adoption and that community has driven a base of enterprises that are trying to industrialize CI/CD, and that's been the base that we've been able to sell into, where we've got close to 50% of the Fortune 100 as paying customers when people are trying to scale their CI/CD from a single Jenkins server. So, so for CloudBees, open source has been a key part of the strategy. Our founders came out of Red Hat and JBoss, and it was almost a no-brainer that if you're going to do something, that's developer-centered, you need an open source community as its base. I bring a little bit more of a freemium community model experience. So love me or hate me, it was my decision in 2005 to make Splunk freemium, but closed source proprietary and not open source. It was an open question when I got there. And I think it was the right decision in 2005. I think there's room for freemium, land and expand, and communities of developers that are extending and building on top of and users of free products. They're technical practitioners and open source communities. And at this stage of CloudBees, we're trying to get the two to coexist.
Matt, you kind of have a classic model.
We have sort of a classic developer bottom-up product that's a platform as a service, but that's surrounded by a lot of open source efforts, right? So our core product is a fully managed platform running a CI/CD pipeline, our own application delivery network, and a local development environment, sort of tying all of that together. But then we've surrounded that with a lot of investment into the open source community, into projects like Hugo, like Gatsby, like Vue and React that all also run all of their web properties on Netlify, and contributed properties like Netlify CMS or our identity service as open source products. So we sort of have a model more similar to GitHub, where you can say that our own core platform is not open source, but but we engage a lot with the open source communities and see ourselves as big supporters of it.
NPM is free it's a freemium model for open source users. We've been sort of the hub of the JavaScript ecosystem for a bunch of years now, since we grew too big for me to run on my spare time and had to start a company around it. There are open source implementations of the NPM registry, but there's none that can scale to 12 million users. So the actual implementation that we have of the NPM registry is entirely closed source, and we have I don't know about entirely closed, mostly closed source, and we have proprietary products, NPM orgs and NPM Enterprise, which are both also not open source products. But our client, the NPM CLI, is of course an open source project, always has been, and that's a thing that we've been developing in the open ever since long before the company existed.
So all y'all's models are a little bit different than what sometimes people really think of as the classic open core model. And sometimes you talk to people about open core and they start nodding their heads, and then when you really dig in, you're like, oh wait, you have maybe a slightly different conception of open core than I was working off of, or maybe you were working off of. So I'd love for you all to talk about, like, what do you think that really means, and how viable do you think it is right now, and who's doing it well, in your opinion? Matt, you look like you have ideas.
It's a good question. Who's doing it well? Probably GitLab is doing a great job of it, and has reached
Got some GitLab
a lot
stands
of
in the
people.
audience.
I think it's always been challenging for the ones that really start very strongly with an open source project to go from having to both build and maintain that open source project. It's a ton of work to actually work with a community and accept pull requests and triage bugs and make sure that contributions is something you actually want. And then at the same time, often also have to build a separate product that's not their open source product. So they sort of end up getting two different product streams that they have to work on with the same team as if they only had one. So I think that's the challenge that a lot of like the projects that start purely open source has, right? Where there's maybe an easier model when in the case of Netlify, we've like supported very strongly a lot of different open source projects, and we've made a platform that you can use with React, with Gatsby, with Hugo, with Vue, and with anything that comes up in that space, without us being sort of one of the specific players in that space, and without us having to build our own framework, our own site generators, or anything like that. That allows us to just focus on building our core platform, and then building open source projects more in the periphery of that, and contributing back to the community, but not having to own it and be the open source project.
Now, Christina, you actually do kind of own an open source.
Well, sort of. So we don't legally own the project. In fact, we just helped start with Google and others, the Continuous Delivery Foundation, and helped arrange the transfer of Jenkins and the new Jenkins X project to that foundation. I think we went through a stage that's similar to what you're describing, sort of our adolescent stage, where we started making a significant amount of money from the enterprise flavor of Jenkins. We got a lovely, very strong enterprise sales team in place, and we started, having arguments internally that spilled to the external community about, well, if we're going to develop this thing that that is being asked for, if someone's willing to pay for it, that an enterprise sales rep brings us, then we should make it premium. And that got us to the verge of something unhealthy, and I think we've pulled back from that, and so we've doubled down our commitment to the resources internally that are contributing to pure Jenkins open source. We've tried to delineate a clear line, and really we don't consider our commercial premium product to be a flavor of Jenkins anymore, and architecturally it's evolving away from plugins to Jenkins to something that is more than CI/CD, that leverages Jenkins for the CI/CD execution, and that lets us be cleaner. That has let us take some things that we had made proprietary, make them open source. And so for now, we have a line. We also introduced CloudBees Jenkins support and the CloudBees Jenkins distribution. So we really are making that clear line of, if Jenkins is, if you need CI/CD for an individual development team, then we want to continue to invest in Jenkins being your best option for flexible, self-managed CI/CD. And if we have gaps there, it's a priority to fill them. And we want to make the free distribution stuff that is also developer adoption driven, but is maybe more than what people think of, and you'll see that over time. But we're very willing to have things hop over the line into open source when conditions warrant that. And then we're building a lot more innovation, and the line for the premium product is really when you have many teams trying to coordinate software development across an organization. And we can monetize support off of an individual Jenkins server. So we're trying to make a more clear delineation. And it's something we have the luxury of doing at scale. So we just made an acquisition of Electric Cloud that was announced week before last. At that stage, that puts us over 500 people. We have enough, and we have a commitment on the part of our leadership to really investing in product and in open source. So we have the luxury of doing that. But I think a clear delineation and really being forceful as a product team with your sales team in saying that you build products for market segments, and one existence proof of one customer willing to pay you for something that should be on your open source line is not a reason to make it, or even 10 customers is not a reason to make it premium and rob your open source project of success.
That kind of segues nicely into managing your community and kind of taking that community from open source to paid. You don't necessarily want to take everybody in your community to the paid product if open source is solving their pain point, if they might not be great customers long term. And I know NPM is doing some really good marketing now to the community. I've gotten several quite well-worded emails from you, in fact.
I think I wrote some of them.
Yes.
Yeah, it is kind of a fine line to walk. I think it would be, well, I'd be busy, loafing around on a private island if all of everyone in our community was a paid customer. But like you said, it sort of doesn't make sense. And if the open source product can meet their needs, then from my point of view, that's actually good. And the purpose of our paid products and the purpose of our enterprise motion is to really do business in such a way that the people who need the enterprise features are paying for them, and that payment is subsidizing the growth of this open source movement. And I think that if you think about this, that's the kind of the good way of looking at it, and the evil or self-serving way of looking at it is that's seeding the ground for a really powerful position for our company to be in, where every developer who writes JavaScript with NPM. They go to work at a company, and what product are they going to need? They're going to need something to be able to do NPM at that enterprise, and we're kind of there, ready with the ideal tool for that need.
Matt, you also have, what did you call it, a magic button?
Well, we've always been looking for one, right? Since our model is really getting as many developers as possible on board of our platform and making Netlify part of the tool build of any web developer out there, and then selling over time to the companies that these developers work for and are employed by. And we've always sort of said internally that if we had some magic button we could press where any developer using the product would not pay anything, and where the companies that they work for would automatically pay us, that's the button we want to press, right? Because developers are also horrible to monetize from. I always remember seeing some very technical co-founder of a company that had IPO'd talking on stage at a developer conference and opening a code editor and Sublime Text back in the days, and the little nagging window pops up saying can you please pay me $29 for a one-time fee for the tool you use the most in your whole professional career, and he just instinctively pushes the cancel button because of course not, right? And that's kind of how developers work. But then on the other end, as soon as a company hires developers to build something for them, there's typically a pretty big budget involved because developers are not cheap. So that's where you want to charge for the value you're providing. So we've always been looking for, like, where's that matching button where we can make sure that when developers comes in and kicks the tires and build their own projects and participates in open source, they don't have to pay. But once there's a real commercial use case, there's also a real business plan behind it.
Can I argue with you just a little bit on that
Yeah.
point? So I don't quite agree with the idea that just because a developer is working inside of a company that the tools should be paid for by the company, and I don't know if you meant it quite that literally.
No.
But I think there's a big so first off, I think it's most important for companies like ours where the adoption starts with practitioners and developers to get that adoption and that baseline of adoption and the adoption of people learning to code in school, learning on hobby projects, working on open source projects, and then within companies working on experimental or innovation projects. These are all places that habits get formed.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part that's really hard because it's so hard for an enterprise sales organization or marketing organization that comes from a company that is classic, trials, marketing funnel, whatever, not to consider the entire community, their marketing funnel. And, it's way pre to that. And so for me, adoption is key and engagement is key and learning and building that community is key. And that was very true for us with a free community of users at Splunk. Like, we did decide to make it proprietary. We decided to do everything else as if we were an open source community and be very transparent and open, very engaged with our users, very generous with our communications, with our support and everything. And that was early days. Things have changed a little bit, evolved, but and we loved, having a community of people who would show up to Friday night events who were kids in school playing with Splunk. And those are people who became the basis of professionals who brought Splunk from company to company with them. So really try to understand that that's a different thing. And as soon as they get a job with a company, that company is not going to invest in their tools yet. It's got to be a point at which the projects they're working on or things need to become an enterprise standard. And at the point that, what we want them to do is we want them to do such cool stuff inside their companies that other people become aware and they want to start making it a platform in their company.
When we talk about communities that we are reaching out to, try to convert some, not all, maybe to paid customers. I mean, community is not really a faucet that you can turn on and off, right? You have to keep maintaining, keep building, keep reaching out to your communities. But how do you balance the effort that it takes to maintain community trust with commercial success, right? If you spend all your time maintaining your community, that is not going to work well. And if you spend all your time trying to sell them stuff, that's not going to work well either.
I think really this comes down to having really clear understanding and really clear definition about what you're actually referring to when you say community and maintain and manage, because people throw around these words and frequently have very different understandings of what that word actually means and what is referred to by our community, what is referred to by, like, what kind of management or what kind of engagement are we talking about with them. And I've seen throughout my career, like, countless times where two people have a meeting, and frequently, in all honesty, sometimes I'm one of them, have a meeting and we all agree and we all nod our heads and we all walk out, we even take notes and we all agree to what the notes say, and then we leave and we are thinking completely different things because we have never actually taken the time to drill down and say, what do we mean when we say community? And that is, that's really crucial. Like, I get asked sometimes, like, NPM was, you're so successful building a community. How do I build a community around my product? And, like, my answer is a lot of times, like, go back to 2009, write a JavaScript package manager. I'm sorry, that's literally the best advice I have for you. And if you have a time machine, like, don't waste it on that. Do something cooler. Like, and so, this question of, like, how do you engage with and maintain, how do you engage with a community? How do you maintain credibility with them and so on? I think, one way that I look at it is you basically have these concentric circles of what could be referred to as community. From NPM's point of view, at the broadest possible level, it's everyone who uses JavaScript. which is a tremendous number of people. Most of them are already using NPM, and most of them are never going to pay for NPM. A couple layers in, there's like people who publish packages, or people who are involved in open source, or people who are working at big companies sharing proprietary code. They're all part of our community, but they're not really, you can't engage with them all in the same way and using the same techniques. So, and in some cases, what it means is engagement with this or that open source foundation, or pulling some sort of representatives or select members into advisory boards or to product management discussions, or just sending out mailing lists and sort of being engaged on all of the social medias and in GitHub and all the different forums for those. We have this we actually have a website called npm.community, which is a discourse board. And that is also, that's not the definition of what our community is, right? That's just a part of it that are deciding to engage in that particular way. So I think it's important to, meet these people where they are, figure out what you mean by community and how you want to grow it and why strategically that's valuable. And make sure that you're really drilling into specifics when you're talking about this with your team, because you can go off the rails real easily.
Matt, do you have some specifics about your community?
Well, the idea of concentric circles resonates a lot. Like, we always thought around that, especially with developer products, right? Like, you have these specific early adopters that you want to reach first, and then it sort of flows out from there. And my co-founder and I, we literally started with a list of 20 people that we had to get hold of, and at least half of them had to get what we were doing and think it was a good idea, because we identified them as the ones that were sort of already thinking in that space and had already built stuff in that space. And if they thought what we were doing didn't have value and didn't add something, then we should probably go back to the drawing board and rethink things, right? So we really started there and then grow it from there. And then it's a little similar to it's similar to the motion of content marketing in general, where you have to give something that's valuable to the community all the time, right? So when we push out something that's open source, it should be something that some people find interesting and valuable enough to build around it and adopt on. And you have to constantly think in that way of what is it that's lacking out there? Look at the existing community and see where there's some gaps in content or in tooling or in open source projects that if you can fill them, people will get real value out of and get excited about.
Well, if I may, just on that for a second. So I think one thing that's sort of lurking behind both of your answers I want to call out, which is, so I'd say it's a Venn diagram of your open source community and your company community and different roles. So for your open source community, and I'm less the expert on this than Kasuke or founder Sasha is, but there's a whole set of techniques. So you guys know that about getting contributors to a project, getting people to do stuff with you, and and getting companies to do that with you, getting developers to do that with you, and that is a really important part of the machine. And then there's the level of if you have extension points on either your open source or your free product, getting an app developer community, that an ecosystem around your product or your project is a whole different thing. And then getting community dynamics around the users of your project or product is a whole different thing. And these are going to be overlapping sets of people and companies. And I think that it takes different people in the organization to be attuned to each of those different subsets of the community and spend their days really focused on that.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
And also, when you were talking about ecosystem building, having third-party developers plugging into your open source product or your commercial product, that sounds like a community-driven thing that actually leads to revenue. Third-party developers.
Yeah. It leads to revenue directly from those developers, less than it does from all the people who want to use what those developers have built, right? And the plugin ecosystem around Jenkins is an example of that. The app ecosystem around Splunk is an example of that. And it just makes everything larger. And individuals float between these different roles, and they also permeate as you grow. People, leave the community and come and join your company, and then go back out, and then come back out, and go here, go there. So individuals take their habits with them. and and have this conversation a lot at CloudBees because there's a little bit of disbelief in terms of hardcore open source folks that you can have a developer ecosystem around a free but premium or a commercial product just based on APIs and extension points. And I think, Splunk, Slack, there's a ton of existence proofs, against that. But, it does allow developers to make a proprietary tool their own, which gets to a level of, love in the community, which is something we haven't been talking about here, which is how do people start loving being part of this community and ecosystem and building relationships with each other and emotional relationships with working on this, on this product or project.
I mean, we see that with closed source API products like Stripe and Twilio. There's a lot of love for those, and they're not open source.
Exactly.
Are there other kind of community behaviors, community activities that in your experience have led directly to product revenue? Matt's shaking his head. He's like,
well, I'm
all
just
the
thinking.
site generators put
I
dollars.
mean, obviously, we've invested a lot on our end in growing the community around tooling, and we've even now seen companies like Gatsby that when we started out were small hobby projects running on our platform that's now become venture-backed companies, and projects like Storybook that has risen up and so on, right? That are all in a space where we've sort of helped seed the ground and help them even with contributions or with sponsorship and so on, that are now a core part of our funnel as well, right? And where we have lots of enterprises buying the package of sometimes Gatsby, Netlify, and Strappy or something like that, right? That's all come out of that open source community that didn't even really exist back when we started.
Anything you want to add, Isaac?
The main ways that we've seen revenue come about from our open source users is, if you are as team sizes grow, the needs of that team start to grow. If the three of us wanted to build an app and use NPM, we wouldn't really need anywhere special to put our proprietary code, our closed source code for our app. We just put it in the Git repo. And when we push a new change, we just tap the person on the shoulder and say, hey, there's a new change, you need to pull it before you rebuild. Once you grow to about 5 people, that starts to become really onerous, right? The lines of communication start to multiply, or it's a factorial relationship, right? And so what we've seen are a few natural tipping points as team sizes grow, where our orgs product starts to make a lot of sense, and when they start to grow beyond that, an enterprise product starts to make sense, because now at an enterprise scale, you have collections of teams, right? You have multiple different teams that all need to leverage one another's code, very similar to the way it works in the open source ecosystem itself. As a company grows, it kind of approaches the biggest enterprise, which is open source. So the way that we typically approach that is we just look at, who are the biggest users of JavaScript, and how many developers do they have? Can we get one of their teams using NPM Enterprise? And even if we start that sale at 10 or 20 seats, which is not a huge deal for us, but we know that there's 1,000 developers at that company. It's going to expand because other devs at their company are going to want to use the code that they're producing, and it will grow in that same way that we've seen in the open source ecosystem. So it's not so much that there's a direct conversion. I guess there kind of is with orgs. People will start doing something on their own and just keep their private code private, and then I want to share it with somebody else, and I'm like, oh, this is a pain. I'm just going to an org is cheap enough, I don't have to think about it so much. And now we've got everybody on a team, and when that org starts to grow and split up into multiple teams, now we have a salesperson reach out to them.
I think actually if you're looking for something more tactical, because my first reaction, my sort of open mouth reaction to the question is that's not a question to me, which is if you have a strong selling proposition and go to market for your enterprise or commercial product, anything you do to build the base of users on the contingent, open source or free product, of course it helps. Anything you do to build development ecosystem around that to make the product better, of course it helps. Is it cost effective? You have to run the numbers, but it's sort of a no-brainer. But then I was thinking about it more, and I think we may be looking for something more tactical. So events, so how do you get anonymous open source users who are very familiar with, or free users who are very, rabid users that you don't know that are using free Splunk or open source Jenkins, and how do you address them in a way that doesn't put them off? So events at both Splunk and at CloudBees have been key to this. Webinars are increasingly important, but they have to, I think you create content that appeals to the average open source or free user that is not hard sell, and you have just elements usually of users or sponsors of the commercial use of product at your customers also at those events. I like to run panels that mix free and open source and premium users. When I run those panels, I like to have challenging questions. I like people to say all the reasons that open source or free is fine, and and sort of push back on the hard sell, because it's about getting the community to sell each other, and it's much better for an open source Jenkins developer at our customer ABN AMRO to get on stage at one of our events and talk about the distinct value of using the commercial CloudBees product, and us not to do the hard sell. And you can advertise these things to the community in various public forums and so forth, but you have to be genuine about advertising them as community events, and then you just happen to be present there with your commercial product.
Definitely events get the word out in a non-salesy way if you do them the right way.
Yeah.
We have time, I think, for one more question, which really wanted to give you all a chance to say, okay, we all have had a lot of experience, all as founders as well. And what would you tell a founder who's starting today about free, tier, open source, open core, community-driven efforts? Like, if you were the ancient mariner, what would you grab them by their arm and say, hey, you have to listen to me about this?
You can't do community or open source as an afterthought. Like, we're going to open source this thing that's been commercial and mildly successful but not successful enough. Doesn't work. You have to design it in from the first. And the decision about free versus open source or doing both, to me, is driven by if the primary engine of selection of technology is going to be developers self-selecting that technology, it has to be open source today. You can do other premium stuff, but the foundation has to be open source. If the engine is that they're selecting a tool or a service in the market, you can do freemium, but you have to do either open source or freemium if you're going to be practitioner-led, and then you think about land and expand and the cutting off point for commercial. But you can't work backwards from an enterprise model that's middling working and work your way backwards to a practitioner-driven model very effectively.
And be mindful of which one you pick, right? Like, don't just pick one because you like open source or something, right? Like, pick one because it's the right for the product you're building. Like, think about it is a product that has a path where people can very easily adopt it and go on board, or is it a product that requires that someone comes and really gives a sales pitch and an introduction and a demo, right? Like, there's very, very, very good products that just inherently work like that, that doesn't have like a simple free onboarding flow that makes any sense, right? So build it into the product from the ground up and think about it as if you're building this kind of product, you're really building in the acquisition and sales channel into the product instead of having it sort of as an external part, right? So that has to really make sense for the product before you start doing it.
There's a lot of nodding going on from you, Isaac.
Yeah, everything they said was great. I'm trying to think if I could go back in time and sort of like grab myself by the shoulders, what I would say. So I think that yeah, open source is not a verb. Don't use it as one. If it's not already open source, you're not going to get much value by open sourcing it. Just go do a different thing. I would say whenever possible, open source the tools and freemium the services. Just as a simple rule of thumb, like you don't need the service that you're providing via a web endpoint or whatever to be open source, because people are just going to hit it anyway, and the fact that they can get the source code is not really that big a deal. But tools, if you want tools to be picked up by practitioners, that tool has to be open source, because that's going to be your entry point in. And people will tend to use a free open source tool, much even if it's significantly worse than a paid proprietary tool. A lot of people will use the open source ones just because they know they can fix problems with it, or they can get help from a community. And I think the third thing is, build a community by focusing on the ways that people are going to use your tool to meet their own needs. So, how do people using this tool make money? Like, how can people using this tool attain fame and notoriety in an open source community? How is it going to help them get a job? How is it going to help them have satisfaction in their life? Like, whatever the need is that your tool is meeting, that's going to be the thing that gets them to adopt your product and gets them to become really evangelists for your product.
Cool. Well, thank you all for sharing your often hard-won experience and knowledge with us today. And I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much.